In 1857, New York City passed a comprehensive building code that specified load-bearing requirements for cast-iron facades, mandated fire-resistant stairwell construction, and required minimum courtyard dimensions for ventilation in structures that wouldn't become standard for another 15 years. The code included detailed provisions for elevator shafts in residential buildings. In 1857, Elisha Otis had demonstrated his safety elevator just 3 years earlier. Fewer than 20 buildings in America had elevators. Most were experimental. Yet the regulations governing them were thorough, specific, and written as though the technology was already commonplace. By 1860, similar codes appeared in Philadelphia, Boston, and Chicago, each addressing construction methods and materials that were not yet widely adopted. The regulations anticipated cast-iron framing, standardized window dimensions, and plumbing systems that most builders had never installed. The codes existed before the buildings they described. This isn't speculation. The documents are archived, dated, and publicly accessible. This documentary examines historical building codes and construction regulations that appeared in the mid-19th century, particularly in the United States and United Kingdom. It explores observable timing patterns, regulatory language, and infrastructure standards that seem to anticipate future construction rather than respond to existing conditions. All information presented is drawn from public records, architectural histories, and municipal archives. Multiple interpretations of these patterns exist. This is not an attempt to prove or disprove any particular theory, but to examine what the documents themselves reveal. Most building codes emerge reactively. A tenement burns. A balcony collapses. Public outcry demands accountability. Legislators respond with new safety standards based on what just failed. That's the expected pattern. But in the 1850s and 1860s, dozens of American and British cities adopted building codes that don't fit this model. They didn't respond to disasters. They didn't emerge from court cases or insurance claims. They appeared complete, detailed, and specific before the construction techniques they regulated were in common use. London's Metropolitan Building Act of 1844 is one of the earliest examples. It established rules for structural walls, fire separation, and drainage systems. But it also included provisions for buildings of a height and density that didn't yet exist in London outside a few experimental projects. The language assumes familiarity with construction methods that were still emerging. The timing is notable. In 1848, revolutions swept across Europe. Governments collapsed. Populations shifted. Infrastructure strained under sudden demographic pressure. Within 5 years, building codes in multiple cities, from Manchester to Liverpool to Glasgow, had been revised or newly created, each containing provisions for urban density and sanitation infrastructure that wouldn't be fully realized until the 1870s. Boston's building regulations of 1855 required fireproof construction in commercial districts where most structures were still wood. The code outlined standards for masonry thickness, iron beam placement, and compartmentalized construction, techniques borrowed from industrial buildings and applied to urban housing that hadn't been built yet. Chicago's building code of 1856 addressed skyscraper construction principles 2 decades before the word skyscraper was coined. It specified foundation depth for multi-story buildings on soft soil, regulated wind load tolerances, and mandated setback requirements for structures over 6 stories. In 1856, Chicago had no buildings over 5 stories. The tallest structure in the city was a church steeple. The regulations existed before the demand. Philadelphia's 1859 housing code is particularly striking. It includes detailed language about court dwellings, multifamily residential buildings arranged around interior courtyards, and specifies minimum air circulation, natural light access, and shared plumbing configurations. These designs became standard in the 1880s. In 1859, Philadelphia's housing stock was overwhelmingly single-family row homes. The code describes buildings that didn't exist yet in the city that wrote the regulations. This pattern repeats across regions. Liverpool's building bylaws of 1842 addressed terraced housing layouts, back-to-back construction restrictions, and minimum street widths for working-class neighborhoods that were still being conceptualized. The Sanitary Act of 1866 formalized many of these standards nationally, but local codes had already incorporated them decades earlier. Manchester's regulations from the 1840s include provisions for cellar dwellings, basement apartments and industrial housing, that anticipate ventilation problems and structural issues before those dwellings became widespread. The language suggests experience with failures that hadn't yet occurred. This creates a strange chronology. By the 1860s, dozens of cities across the United States and United Kingdom had adopted strikingly similar building codes. They shared language, referenced the same construction techniques, and addressed the same infrastructure challenges, even in cities with entirely different architectural histories, economic contexts, and geographic conditions. The codes feel standardized. New York's 1862 Tenement House Act regulated room sizes, window placement, and ventilation in multifamily housing. It set maximum occupancy per square foot and required access to running water. These standards mirror regulations passed in Glasgow in 1862 and Liverpool in 1864, despite no formal coordination between the cities. The synchronization is difficult to explain through independent development. In each case, the regulations addressed construction at a scale beyond what the cities had yet experienced. They anticipated density, sanitation crises, and structural failures that would only materialize later, once the buildings they governed were actually constructed. The question isn't whether these codes existed. They did. The archives are clear. The question is how cities with no shared regulatory framework, no formal coordination, and vastly different construction traditions ended up with nearly identical building standards, written before the buildings themselves were built. And why those standards assumed an urban future that hadn't arrived yet. The Erie Canal opened in 1825. It stretched 363 miles from Albany to Buffalo, connecting the Hudson River to the Great Lakes. The scale was unprecedented. But the scale wasn't the strange part. The strange part was the infrastructure built along it. Within 2 years of the canal's completion, dozens of grain storage facilities appeared along its route. Massive stone warehouses designed to hold quantities of grain that the region wasn't yet producing. The structures were built with reinforced foundations, ventilation systems for bulk storage, and loading mechanisms for barge transport at volumes that wouldn't be reached until the 1840s. The facilities predated the demand. Buffalo, at the canal's western terminus, had a population of roughly 2,400 in 1825. By 1830, the city had constructed port facilities, warehouses, and grain elevators capable of handling cargo loads equivalent to a city of 50,000. The infrastructure assumed growth that hadn't happened yet. And the growth came. By 1850, Buffalo's population had surged to over 42,000. The port facilities built in the late 1820s were suddenly appropriate. The oversized warehouses were suddenly necessary. The canal's capacity, which had seemed excessive in 1825, was being fully utilized. The infrastructure had anticipated its own future. This pattern appears across early American rail development. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, chartered in 1827, constructed station facilities and maintenance yards scaled for traffic levels the railroad wouldn't see for 15 years. The stations included freight handling systems, passenger waiting areas, and administrative buildings designed for a rail network that was still largely theoretical. The first 13 miles of track opened in 1830. The station at Mount Clair was built to accommodate 6 platforms and multiple daily departures. In 1830, the railroad ran 2 trains per day. Similar decisions were made in Britain. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway opened in 1830, constructed Edge Hill Station with underground tunnels, a rope haulage system, and platform capacity for traffic that wouldn't materialize until the late 1840s. The station was criticized at the time for being unnecessarily large. By 1848, it was operating at full capacity. The infrastructure wasn't responding to demand. It was anticipating it. London's sewer system provides another example. Joseph Bazalgette's London sewerage system, constructed between 1859 and 1875, was designed for a population of 4 million. London's population in 1860 was 2.8 million. Bazalgette built the tunnels with twice the capacity he calculated was necessary, stating he expected the city to grow. He was correct. By 1900, London's population had reached 4.5 million, and the system was operating within its design parameters. But Bazalgette's decision was unusual for the time. Most infrastructure projects were built to meet immediate needs, not speculative future growth. His system was an outlier, except it wasn't. Across the United Kingdom and United States, similar decisions were being made simultaneously. Glasgow's water supply system, completed in 1859, drew from Loch Katrine and was designed to provide 50 million gallons per day, triple the city's consumption at the time. The aqueducts, reservoirs, and distribution networks were scaled for a population Glasgow wouldn't reach until the 1890s. New York's Croton Aqueduct, completed in 1842, delivered 90 million gallons of water per day to a city that consumed roughly 30 million. The system included distribution mains, holding reservoirs, and pressure regulation for a network that wouldn't be fully utilized for decades. The systems anticipated growth that hadn't occurred. Manchester's railway viaducts, constructed in the 1840s, were built with foundations and load-bearing capacities that exceeded the requirements of the trains running on them. The structures could support significantly heavier locomotives and freight cars than existed at the time. By the 1870s, when train weights had increased substantially, the viaducts required no reinforcement. They had been over-engineered from the beginning. This creates a peculiar timeline. Between 1840 and 1870, cities across the industrializing world constructed infrastructure that seemed excessive, premature, or financially irresponsible at the time, and then grew into that infrastructure within a generation. The growth rates required to justify the initial investment were extraordinary. Philadelphia's population grew from 220,000 in 1840 to 674,000 in 1870. The city's water and gas distribution systems, installed in the 1840s, were designed for the latter figure. Boston's population doubled between 1840 and 1870. Its rail terminals, built in the early 1850s, were scaled for the 1870 population. The pattern repeats. Chicago's grain elevators, constructed in the 1850s, were designed to handle harvest volumes from agricultural regions that were still being settled. The elevators assumed rail connections that didn't exist and farming outputs that hadn't been achieved. By 1870, the infrastructure was fully utilized. The question isn't whether these systems were eventually needed. They were. The question is how planners in multiple cities across 2 continents, with no centralized coordination, consistently built infrastructure scaled for populations and economic activity that wouldn't exist for another 20 to 30 years. And why the growth rates necessary to justify those decisions occurred almost exactly on schedule. Administrative systems followed the same pattern. The U.S. Post Office expanded rapidly in the 1840s and 1850s, establishing offices in towns that barely existed. By 1860, the postal system included over 28,000 offices, many in settlements with fewer than 100 residents. The infrastructure assumed future population centers. Britain's Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 created a national system of workhouses and administrative boards scaled for a level of urbanization and poverty management that hadn't yet materialized. By the 1860s, the system was operating at capacity. Census records became standardized and detailed in the same period. The 1841 British Census introduced individual enumeration, recording names, ages, occupations, and birthplaces for every household. This level of administrative detail was unprecedented. It required infrastructure, enumerators, processing clerks, storage facilities, that seemed excessive for a one-time survey. But the system remained and expanded. The U.S. Census of 1850 introduced similar methods. By 1870, both nations had comprehensive demographic data collection systems that tracked population movement, occupational shifts, and household composition at a granular level. The administrative capacity existed before the complexity it managed. Whether this reflects inherited systems being adapted to new populations, coordination between industrializing nations, or independent parallel development in response to similar pressures, the timing remains striking. The infrastructure appeared first. The need followed. The term Tartaria appears on European maps from the 15th through 19th centuries. It referred to the vast regions of Central Asia, Siberia, and parts of Eastern Europe, territories largely outside direct European control. The name derived from Tatar, referring to various Turkic and Mongolic peoples. On maps, Tartaria was often a catch-all label for areas that were geographically known but politically and culturally distant from Western Europe. It wasn't a unified empire. It wasn't a single civilization. It was a cartographic convention, a way of marking territory that existed beyond the edges of European administration. By the late 19th century, as European powers expanded their geographic knowledge and colonial reach, the term disappeared from maps. The regions previously labeled Tartaria were reclassified into more specific political and ethnic designations: Siberia, Turkestan, Mongolia, Manchuria. The label faded as precision replaced generalization. In recent years, Tartaria has been reinterpreted. Online communities have used the term to describe a proposed advanced civilization that allegedly existed before the 19th century, one that built the grand infrastructure, elaborate civic architecture, and sophisticated urban systems that now bear other attributions. In this framework, the synchronous building codes, over-engineered infrastructure, and administrative systems discussed in this documentary are viewed as remnants or reuses of an earlier, more developed society. This interpretation exists. It has gained significant traction in alternative historical discussions. But it is one interpretation among several. A second interpretation holds that the patterns observed, standardized building codes, anticipatory infrastructure, administrative synchronization, reflect the natural outcomes of industrialization and information exchange. In this view, engineers, planners, and legislators across Britain and the United States were responding to shared challenges using shared knowledge. Professional journals, international exhibitions, and governmental correspondence allowed best practices to spread rapidly. The similarities weren't mysterious. They were the result of coordination, not coincidence. This explanation accounts for much of the observable evidence. A third interpretation suggests something between these poles, that the 19th century saw the large-scale adaptation and repurposing of existing infrastructure, whether from earlier construction phases, previous administrative systems, or inherited urban frameworks, that was then integrated into new national and industrial contexts. In this model, the anticipatory quality of the infrastructure reflects not prediction, but renovation. The systems appeared ready-made because they were built upon foundations that already existed. Each interpretation engages with the same evidence. Each offers a framework for understanding the timing, scale, and coordination observed in the historical record. What remains consistent across all three is the evidence itself. The building codes existed before widespread adoption of the techniques they regulated. The infrastructure was scaled beyond immediate demand. The administrative systems appeared with a level of sophistication that suggests either prior experience or extraordinary foresight. And the timing, concentrated in the decades following 1840, creates a density of development that continues to invite examination. The year 1816 returns to relevance here. It was called the Year Without a Summer. The eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815 sent volcanic ash into the atmosphere, disrupting weather patterns across the northern hemisphere. Crop failures followed. Famine spread. Migration intensified. Populations that had been stable for generations began moving into cities, across borders, toward new economic opportunities. Within a generation, the infrastructure that would accommodate this movement was already being built. Whether this reflects a response to observable demographic pressures, an inherited system being reactivated, or the organized expansion of industrial society using knowledge from prior phases, the timeline is compressed. The transformation from agrarian to urban, from local to national, from traditional to industrial, occurred faster than comparable shifts in earlier centuries. And the infrastructure preceded the transformation. The metaphor of Tartaria functions in this context as a placeholder. It allows people to name a pattern they observe but struggle to explain through conventional historical narratives. It creates space for questions about timing, scale, and origin that traditional histories sometimes skip past in favor of progress narratives. But the metaphor is not the evidence. The evidence is the codes themselves. The warehouses that sat half-empty for years before becoming essential. The rail stations built for traffic that didn't exist. The sewer systems designed for populations that hadn't arrived. The administrative infrastructure that assumed a level of complexity before that complexity had materialized. These are documented, measurable, and open to examination. Whether they reflect inheritance, coordination, or anticipation, they mark a period where infrastructure and regulation aligned with a future that was approaching, but hadn't yet arrived. The documentary framework for understanding this period is still being written. The evidence invites multiple perspectives. The patterns remain visible in the archives, the blueprints, and the structures themselves. What was built between 1840 and 1870 shaped the cities we inhabit today. The codes written then still influence construction standards now. The infrastructure laid in that compressed period remains in use, adapted but recognizable. The questions it raises are not about hidden truths or suppressed histories. They are about timing, about scale, about how societies prepare for futures they can see coming, or futures they've seen before. The structures remain. The codes are archived. The timeline is documented. What we make of it continues to evolve.